Welcome to episode 3 of Incredible Teams, the show that explores the tales behind the world's best teams, the tactics that got them there, and how you can use some of them to apply to your own. This is your host Liam Hurd, and today we are diving into the Montreal Canadiens of 1955 to 1960, the only team to win 5 consecutive Stanley Cups, the grandest trophy in all of hockey. So just briefly, for non-North American listeners, when I say hockey, from here on, I mean ice hockey, not field hockey. Montreal, Quebec is considered by many to be the spiritual home of hockey. Other cities, states, countries may try to lay claim, but the sport is etched into the very fabric of Montreal. Its people feel a sense of belonging to the game. Perhaps comparisons can be drawn with the previous 2 episodes, with football, soccer being so ingrained into the Brazilian identity, and rugby being New Zealand's national game. Or perhaps it's most simply understood by hearing the Canadiens slogan in the lead up to their centennial celebrations in 2009, La Ville est hockey. The city is hockey. Now, Pierre Boivin, who was president of the Canadiens at one point and is current chancellor of McGill University, which is in Montreal, said, "To some degree, the city's productivity is influenced by the team's performance. Hockey is part of what makes this city tick." I suppose to sort of emphasize this point, since 1893, 41 Montreal-based hockey teams have won the Stanley Cup. The next best city is Toronto with 15 total wins. And out of that 41, 24 wins are from the Canadiens. So before hockey became hockey, wherever the climate permitted, the raw and informal game of shinny was played on frozen lakes, creeks, and rivers. But in 1877, I did see some reports that said 1875, students at McGill University organized the first hockey team and proposed the first set of rules. By 1895, 20-ish years later, hockey had spread rapidly all over Canada and into parts of the US. In Montreal alone, there were teams representing the British, Irish, and Scottish. And out of the city's 465,000 person population at that time, only 155,000, about 1/3, were actually English speaking, and the rest were French. So it's kind of crazy that there were 3 teams representing English speaking people, no teams representing the French. This was partly due to a lack of facilities in the French neighborhoods, and also partly due to sort of a cultural difference between the 2 speakers. French-speaking people were more likely to implement and start up social clubs, versus English-speaking people were more likely to start up athletic clubs. It's kind of an interesting point there. Nevertheless, in 1909, December 4th, 1909, 2 failed French teams had come and gone, and representatives of the newly formed NHA, the National Hockey Association, announced that a French-Canadian team called Les Canadiens would be formed to join the 4 founding members. A month later, on January 5th, 1905, the Montreal Canadiens played their first match against the Cobalt Silver Kings from Cobalt, Ontario, resulting in a 7-6 overtime win. It was a fast-paced, cagey, back-and-forth affair worthy of any team's first game. The next morning, the local Gazette said, "It was a wild hurrah from start to finish, with a scene of tremendous enthusiasm at the finish to mark the first victory of the all-star French-Canadian team." By all accounts, the first season, which stretched about just over 2 months, and actually was just a total of 13 games, was a major disappointment. Despite becoming known as a fast-skating, aggressive side, they finished with 3 wins and 10 losses, and last place in the league. And perhaps worse, fan support was well below what some had expected. One of the books that were one of my main sources for today, by the author Darcy Jennis, The Montreal Canadiens 100 Years of Glory, had this to say: "The Canadiens had failed to win the affections of French Montrealers. Some prominent members of that community refused to take the team seriously." Over the next few seasons, the Canadiens were up and down, sometimes competing strongly, sometimes losing badly against a seemingly revolving list of teams due to foldings and subsequent issuings of new licenses by the NHA. In the 1913-14 season, the team began the never-ending task of community building. Their fans were, quote, for the most part, descendants of the Habitants, the French settlers of the 17th and 18th centuries who had made dangerous ocean crossings, had taken up long, narrow plots of heavily forested land in the St. Lawrence River Valley, and through years of arduous work had turned their land into productive farms. These fans had begun calling the Canadiens L'équipe des Habitants, the team of the Habitants, then simply Les Habitants. The Habs, as they are known and became known, continued playing throughout the First World War. In the 1915-16 season, they won the NHA for the first time, which gave them the opportunity to compete for the Stanley Cup for the first time. And their opponent for this series was the Portland Rosebuds, and the Canadiens turned out to be victorious 3-2, their first Stanley Cup. After the fifth game, the Habs goaltender, Georges Vezina, who the NHL Goaltender of the Year award is named after, received news that his second child had just been born and promptly named him Marcel Stanley to commemorate the victory. Fast forwarding to 1917, after more politics between the 5 member organizations of the NHA, the NHL was formed with 4 teams, the Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, who catered towards the English-speaking side of Montreal, the Ottawa Senators, this is actually a different team to the current Ottawa Senators, and the Quebec Bulldogs. That would unfortunately dwindle to just 3 teams pretty early on into the first season, after the arena where the Canadiens and Wanderers played burned down after 4 games. Both teams lost everything, all their gear, uniforms, etc., but it was the Wanderers who couldn't survive another setback, and they folded. That season was remarkable in another sense thanks to a new Canadiens player, Joe Malone. Malone still holds numerous NHL scoring records thanks to his season that season, when he scored 44 goals in 20 games. And these records include highest goals per game with 2.2, and most 4 and 5 goal games in a season with 5 4-goal games and 3 5-goal games. That's kind of a mouthful. Despite Malone's dominance, the Canadiens couldn't repeat their success of 15-16, and they would have to wait until the 1919 season for another crack at the Cup. This time against the Seattle Metropolitans, who had become the first American team to win the Cup a couple seasons prior. And as of 2024, time of the recording, there have been 2 seasons when the Stanley Cup hasn't been awarded. The 04-05 season due to a player lockout, and the 1919 season due to the outbreak of the Spanish flu that infected around 1/3 of the global population. Kind of crazy. Around 17,000 Montrealers contracted the flu, including 5 of the Canadiens, and one of them, Joe Hall, joined the estimated 25 to 50 million dead worldwide. Another casualty of the flu, albeit 2 years later in 1921, was Canadiens owner, 39-year-old George Kennedy. He had bought the team in 1910, and under his management, the team survived a decade of chaos, as many opponents went out of business and the war and an epidemic raged around them. By trade, Kennedy was a wrestling promoter, but he took to hockey passionately. Jenish writes, Kennedy had entertained them, the fans he means. He had made them laugh. He had made them cheer. He had given them cause to celebrate. Kennedy had acquired the Canadiens when they were just a novelty act and had made the team a source of civic pride. Until his death, Kennedy was part owner, part manager, part coach. The explosion of interest and pride in the team throughout the 20s was in large part actually due to Kennedy's talent for marketing, storytelling, and promotion. The Canadian fan that feels that deep-seated connection with the team today has Kennedy to thank, firstly for buying then keeping afloat, and then ultimately ensuring the team was set to thrive after him. After Kennedy's death, the team was sold for the handsome sum of 11,000 Canadian dollars, which is around 175,000 today, to a holding company owned by three businessmen with deep ties to Montreal. The main proponent was a man by the name of Leo Dandurand, and he was the main proponent of the acquisition, and he took on the responsibility of manager too. In 1924, he helped the Canadiens to their second Stanley Cup with his new young star, Howie Morenz. Morenz, known as the Stratford Streak due to his speed, was a terrific player. He was dominating the league at 22 years old, and he would become one of the original 9 honorees of the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1945. His prowess helped the Canadiens to more sustained success for the next few seasons, including the Cup in the 29-30 and 30-31 seasons. However, heartbreak would soon follow. In 1937, during his second stint with the team, he suffered a horrific broken leg in 4 different places during a game. While towards the tail end of his recovery, he suffered a massive heart attack and passed. One of his teammates, Aurel Joliet, would say, "When he realized that he would never play again, he couldn't live with it. I think Howie died of a broken heart." In 1935, the club changed owners once again, this time for 165,000 Canadian dollars, about 2.6 million today, which was a 15x return, but they had turned down an offer of 300,000 a couple years earlier, so a lot less than they could have got potentially. And then 5 years later, it was sold on again, this time to the owners of the Canadiens Arena, the Canadian Arena Company. And the Arena Company hired 47-year-old Dick Irvin, who would, over the next 15 seasons, finally give the Canadiens some consistent success. Under his guidance, the team won 3 Stanley Cups and reached another 5 Stanley Cup finals. They also won the NHL 4 seasons in a row. Irvin's success was in large part due to Hector Toe Blake, Alma Locke, and Maurice The Rocket Richard, who together were known as the Punchline. This trio of forwards is still regarded as one of the greatest forward lines in NHL history. Irvin first tried them together on the ice in the 43-44 season. That season and the following 3, they won 4 straight titles and 2 Stanley Cups. These 3 men will play a prominent role moving forward in the rest of today's story. Toe Blake, as he was known, is the coach of the team in the period we're discussing today. The Rocket, Richard, is the key protagonist, and Alma Locke tutored Jean Beliveau, one of the Canadiens' greatest ever players and a driving force behind their success. However, before we get to the 1955 season, there are a couple more important things to note about the Canadiens story. In July 46, Frank Selke was hired as the general manager of the Canadiens, and he would stay until 1963, overseeing the teams of 1955 to 60, and in many ways being the chief architect. He had joined from the Maple Leafs in Toronto, where in his role as assistant general manager, he was officially responsible for scouting talent and raising publicity, although he unofficially did a lot more. And one of those unofficial tasks that he was kind of dabbling in was implementing a farm system where the Leafs would financially support minor league and youth teams sort of throughout the region in order to have easier access to better talent and more consistent talent. When he arrived in Montreal, he had inherited that successful team from manager Tom Gorman, who actually had begun setting the groundwork for his own farm system. Gorman's accomplishments are usually pushed to the side when studying the Habs history, but his groundwork that he did is actually really, really important. Nevertheless, when Selke arrived in Montreal, he moved pretty quickly. I'm quoting from Jenish, Selke called a meeting of the directors and said, "You have problems. Canadiens only have 6 players who are better than any other team, and you have nothing in reserve. Your minor league Royals are older than the Canadiens." Senator Raymond asked Selke how he proposed to solve the problem. "I'd like to inaugurate a farm system," Selke said, "with a team in every province to build up young reserves as in Toronto. The players there will be haunting me for years. We owe the people of Montreal a good hockey team," the senator replied. "Go ahead and build an empire." So, with the approval of the directors, Selke went to work. 4 years later, the Canadiens were spending over $150,000 on player development, and at one point this was up to $300,000. They were looking after, or had their hands in the pot of over 10,000 players and 750 teams across Canada. Before the farm system could begin producing talent, the Canadiens continued playing at a high level with their aging players led by the punchline. In the 46-47 season, they would win the league and lose in the Stanley Cup finals. And during that final series, Richard was thrown out of Game 2 after repeatedly fighting opponents and was subsequently banned by the NHL president Clarence Campbell for Game 3. Now, put a pin in Campbell's name, he's going to come back up later and in a big way. At first glance, this banning does not seem all too harsh. Richard, after all, did force 2 Leafs players to leave the game with open, dripping blood head wounds. However, the Canadiens and French Montrealers in general were incensed. Jeunesse writes, "It was excessive and unfair," they said. Some even saw the influence of English Canada at work. After all, earlier in the season, Elmer Lark had his season ended by Leafs player Don Metz, who in punishment received a 2-minute penalty. Now, this is probably as good a time as any to touch on the French-Canadian state of affairs. I'm not going to pretend like I understand the nuances in the relationship between French and English Canadians, but as I understand it, tension has been ever present since colonialism in the 16th century. Montreal is, of course, located in Quebec, where the population is fiercely proud and patriotic about their French heritage. In Sam Walker's book, The Captain Class, he gives a pretty good summary of the state of affairs. 3/4 of the population was French Canadian, but its ruling class was almost exclusively English speaking, and the laws were written and enforced by Anglophones. French Canadians in Montreal were treated as an underclass. They were only a third as likely to graduate from high school, and far more likely to live in poverty. In French-speaking Montreal, the period from 1936 to 1959 is known as La Grande Noirceur. The Canadiens were an avenue through which French Montrealers could throw their support and through which French Canadians could see themselves as superior to English Canadians. Roch Carrière, a famous Quebecois writer who wrote the Rockets' biography, says, "In this Canada that their ancestors discovered, the French Canadians are the servants, the hewers of wood and drawers of water. The language of their ancestors, their language, is looked down on. Winning the Stanley Cup is a proud revenge." And winning the cup turns out to be something that the Canadians are the best at. They are currently at a total of 24, and the next best is Toronto with 13. In order to dismiss the Canadian success, oftentimes rival fans will use the excuse of the French-Canadian rule. This rule was implemented in 1936. It stated that the Canadiens could sign 2 French-Canadian players every year through a special draft. 8 years later, when the rule was rescinded, not one player had been signed through this method. And later the rule would be reinstated and the Canadiens would sign a couple of solid players, but this was in the late 60s, after the time period we're focused on today. Thus, the excuse given by rival fans that the Canadiens cheated their way to success is false. So, as the seasons roll on from the late 40s into the early 50s, a true changing of the guard was well underway for the Canadiens. In the 47-48 season, Toe Blake suffered a broken leg in 2 places and would never play in the NHL again. In 49-50, Ken Reardon, a dominant defenseman, retired before the age of 30 due to an accumulation of injuries. And also in that season, the starting goaltender, Bill Durnan, retired. And Jeunesse writes, "The big goaler had just won his 6th Vezina trophy. He was the quintessential team player. He never blamed his teammates for a weak goal or poor performance, but his nerves were shot. He had been hit in the face by too many pucks, sticks, and errant skate blades. He'd been jeered too often by Montreal's unforgiving fans. He couldn't sleep before or after games. The Canadiens still had veterans Rocket Richard and Elmer Lark until the 53-54 season, and defensemen Butch Bouchard and Bouchard through the 55-56 season. And otherwise, the team assembled by Selke and Coach Irvin, that I'll touch on now, is the team that goes on to become just so incredible. So do bear with me. I know there have been a lot of different names already, but there are a few more coming. And I guess just a note here as well, I do really think it's important to touch on the stories, at least briefly, of these players, given how much of an impact that they had on the result. In previous episodes, like the Brazil episode, for instance, I talked about Pelé and Garrincha a lot, but I kind of just left off all the rest of the players. Perhaps that was a little bit of a mistake. I feel like could have touched on a few more. Each player is just so vital to the overall success of any team, especially in hockey in general. So the whole left in defense was filled by two players, Doug Harvey, a 26-year-old from Montreal, and Tom Johnson, a 22-year-old rookie from Manitoba, which is a 26-hour drive away from Montreal. That's that farm system, that scouting network working. Harvey and Johnson both had rough starts for the Canadiens, however, with fans baying for them to leave, but they would mature quickly into extremely accomplished defensemen. In fact, Doug Harvey would win the James Norris Trophy, which is given to the best defenseman in the NHL, 7 times out of the next 8 seasons, and the only one he didn't win out of the 8 was won by his defensive partner Tom Johnson. So the defensive foundation of the team was set, and now Selke knew he needed to try and match the unmatchable punchline. Bert Olmsted was traded from the Chicago Blackhawks, but he left after the 57-58 season. He went some of the way to filling one of the gaps left by those 3, but wasn't too consistent. One player who was present for all 4 of those glorious years was Bernie Geoffrion, known as one of the early adopters and greatest proponents of the slap shot, which he likened to a golf swing. Geoffrion came from the Montreal Nationals, a junior team sponsored by the Canadiens, once again that farm system. His nickname was Boom Boom, after the sound the puck made off his stick and into the boards. He had an immediate impact upon signing in 51 and helped the team to a Stanley Cup finals, which they ended up losing 3 games to 2 against the Leafs. 2 more stars were added in Dickie Moore and most famously Jean Beliveau. Both were products of that farm system. Moore was a Montrealer through and through, who started with a goal-scoring bang for the Canadiens. He would twice go on to be the league's top scorer in 58 and 59. Moore was delighted to sign with the Canadiens in 51, but Beliveau could probably be described as the exact opposite. Selke had spent over 3 years pursuing his signature, with Jean essentially saying no over and over again. When he did eventually sign just before the season began in 1953, his contract was worth $100,000 to be paid out across 5 seasons, which is worth just over $1.1 million today. That's just crazy for that time. Even though he was a rookie, that was the biggest contract in the NHL at the time. Beliveau had achieved stardom in Quebec City before joining the Canadiens officially, but now his stock rose even further. His first season, he suffered several injuries and didn't live up to the reputation that preceded him, but just you wait, he will. One final player that Selke brought into the team in the 53 season was goaltender Jacques Plante. He was another product of that same farm system, of course. He was actually sent out to the minor league Buffalo Bisons for a couple seasons, but was rushed back in the February of 1954 to replace the injured Jerry McNeil, and he wouldn't lose his starting spot until the 1962-63 season. So, what's that, 8 seasons? Like his defensemen right in front of him, Harvey and Johnson, who I just mentioned, he would dominate the trophy for the best goaltender, the Vezina Trophy, from the 55-56 season onwards. Before we dive into the glory years of those 5 straight cups, there are a few more stories of note to tell, all involving Richard, that should give a pretty good summary of him as a person and player. We've been marching pretty chronologically through the Canadiens' history to this point, but jump back and forth a little now. In the 1952-53 Cup semi-final series, the Rocket scored one of his best and most famous goals. Early in the second period, Richard was checked aggressively by a Boston Bruins player while skating at full speed. He fell into the knee of another Bruins player and collapsed, knocked out cold on the ice, blood pouring out of his head. Many in the arena actually thought his neck was broken, but he refused the stretcher that was brought out for him and headed down the tunnel. Upon returning to the bench after losing consciousness a couple more times, Richard had to ask the scorer and how much time was left. Nevertheless, despite his obvious concussion, Coach Irvin put him in, and Richard proceeded to slip past 3 Bruins players and fire a shot past the goaltender to win the series for the Canadiens. After the game, he said he didn't know where he was and didn't remember a thing. Sports writer Trent Frayne said about Richard, he was at his peak for the dozen years from 1945 to 57, when there was a revolution in hockey's cultural standards. A liberalizing process encouraging the referees to ignore all but the most flagrant violations of the written rules, and which in turn encourages poor or indifferent players to cut good or great players down to size by slamming them bodily into the sides of the rinks, massaging their ribs with fiber-padded elbows, and inserting the crooked blades of hockey sticks between their legs or under their armpits. Author Robert Lefebvre, in his book Tales from the Montreal Canadiens Locker Room, puts it like this. The Rocket did not skate smoothly, nor did he pass the puck with silky skill, or play in his own zone with great measure of defensive accountability. What he did so better than everyone else was take the puck and drive to the goal, almost willing pucks deep into the net by his sheer single-minded determination and perseverance. The Rocket transcended hockey for French Montrealers. Beliveau would write in his autobiography, "When I first arrived in Montreal, the Canadiens may have been managed by Frank Selke, but they were really Maurice Richard's team. The Rocket was the heart and soul of the Canadiens, an inspiration to us all, especially to younger French Canadians who were rising through the ranks. He was man in myth, larger than life in some ways, yet most ordinary human in others." This larger-than-life aspect, this transcendence, this sort of figurehead-like position, reared its head in an ugly but extremely powerful way in 1955 with what would become known as the Richard Riot. The trouble began actually way back in 1947 when the NHL president Clarence Campbell had banned Richard for a game. Remember I said to put a pin in that a few minutes ago? By 1955, Richard's fine list had actually grown to $2,000, and it was a well-established running feud between the two. Richard had actually written a newspaper article calling Campbell a dictator due to what he perceived as a bias against French Canadian players. In March of 55, the Canadiens were playing the Bruins in a regular season match in Boston when it kicked off between Richard, the Bruins, and the referees. Late in the fourth, Richard was hit by a stick in the head and blood started pouring out. It was actually an ex-teammate of his, which perhaps makes it even worse. He did decide to stand up for himself. He swung his stick wildly at that player's face before being seized by a ref. He broke free, whacked the Bruin again with someone else's stick 3 more times before being wrestled to the ground. As he struggled to get back up, he punched the referee, holding him down twice in the face before maybe realizing his mistake and being escorted calmly off the ice. Back in the locker room, the Canadiens wouldn't let Boston policemen in who wanted to arrest Richard. Nonetheless, they knew some pretty severe punishment was coming. They didn't expect this severity. He was banned for the remaining league and playoff games. Jenish summarizes succinctly, "The decision hit the city like a bomb. The bus driver was so distracted that he drove through a level railway crossing and nearly got hit by an oncoming train. Montrealers flooded the NHL office with phone calls. One said, "Tell Campbell I'm an undertaker and he'll be needing me in a few days." Another warned, "I'm no crank, but I'm going to blow your place up." Journalist Jacques Beauchamp described it as simply revolting, a screaming injustice, a flagrant lie, and absolutely false. The mayor of Montreal said, "It would not be necessary to give too many such decisions to kill hockey in Montreal." Trouble began brewing the next day when the Red Wings came to town. Unwisely, Campbell decided to attend the game despite 600 protesters standing outside chanting, "We don't want seats, we want Campbell," after tickets had all been sold out. Inside the arena, he was peppered with abuse, eggs, vegetables, at one point a slap and punch in the face by a fan who had slipped past security. Just as Campbell was about to be surrounded by a mob of young men who were beginning to make their way down to his section, someone let off a smoke bomb on the ice and everyone evacuated the arena. The 50 police officers stationed outside were suddenly extremely outnumbered and a full-blown riot began. At 11 p.m. that night, the mob still numbered 10,000, and by the end of it, around 3 a.m., the damage was substantial, with around 50 stores looted, 100-ish people arrested, and estimated damages of over $1.1 million in 2024 dollars. And this is getting slightly a little bit off topic, but the riot was seen by some historians to be the first whisperings of what would become the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, and this was a period of significant socio-political and socio-cultural upheaval. Without the Rocket, that 54-55 season ended in failure, with the Canadiens losing the Stanley Cup for the second season in a row to Detroit. Despite the farm system beginning to produce a bumper crop, the Canadiens hadn't been able to properly compete with the Red Wings over the last 6 or so years. In that time, Detroit had won 4 cups, Canadiens 1. And in that same period, Detroit had won 6 straight regular season titles. Something was wrong for French Montreal. Their team wasn't winning when it mattered. Their star player, who they most idolized, was banned, and the ever-present sense that they were subservient to the English was beginning to rise and rear its head. Not to mention, in the early 50s, people and cities really everywhere were trying to bounce back from 2 world wars and the Great Depression. So the stage is now set, the pieces have fallen into place. From this citywide feeling of ill will, inferiority, and general malaise, the greatest ever hockey dynasty burst forth. Before the season began in 1955, a new coach was unveiled to replace Dick Irvin. Mr. Toe Blake had returned. He immediately set about making a few new signings, including Richard's younger brother Henri, who would go by the name of Pocket Rocket. Henri actually still holds the record for the most Stanley Cups as a player with 11, and is tied with Bill Russell of the Celtics for the most championships won in any major North American sport. Henri and Maurice would join Dickie Moore in that first choice unit of the front line, with Beliveau leading the second. The Canadiens' dominance all over the ice led to quick success with a 100-point regular season, 24 ahead of Detroit. They cruised through the Cup semifinals and final 4 games to 1. It was a superb first season under winning obsessed Toe Blake. After their first loss in October, he had snapped at a journalist who suggested, "You can't win them all." Montreal rejoiced. There were estimates of over 500,000 in attendance for the victory parade. In the 56-57 season, the team struggled to ride its momentum from the previous season, primarily due to a bunch of injuries. They didn't win the regular season, but when it came time for the Cup, they were fully fit and rearing to go. They beat the New York Rangers in 5 games, with Richard scoring the winning goal to send the Canadiens to the final against the Bruins. They would roll through the Bruins with ease too and end up with a 4-1 series win. Jenish writes, "A good part of the credit for Montreal's second straight cup went to the third line. They shut down Boston's offense, protected leads late in the third period, and contributed timely goals. More importantly, they gave the Canadiens depth to go along with extraordinary talent. The 57-58 season was eventful for Richard. He turned 36, becoming the oldest player in the league. He reached the 500 goal mark, the first player to do that, and suffered an injury that almost ended his career, and then returned to carry the Canadiens to the Cup. During a game against Toronto in November, a Maple Leaf player accidentally stood on Richard's foot and nearly completely severed his Achilles. The wound needed 15 stitches, and he was out for 3 months. In the meantime, the Rockets' first-line teammates, brother Henri and Dickie Moore, would battle it out for the top scorer in the league. Moore would win by 4 points despite playing for the final month with his arm in a cast. Perhaps even more impressively, Moore only allowed the opposition wingers he was up against to score 3 times during the season. His output at both ends of the rink highlights his importance in the absence of the Rocket. Speaking of, Richard would come back from his injury and score 11 goals during the playoffs, including the game-winning goal in overtime during the penultimate game of the finals. Jenish says, they had become the second team in the NHL's 40-year history to win 3 straight Stanley Cups, and the players were jubilant. Fans and players alike leapt onto the ice and mobbed Toe Blake. Richard's injury that held him to only 28 games in the 57-58 season was followed by a serious broken ankle in the 58-59 season, restricting him to only 42 games out of 70. Nevertheless, the depth that Selke had spent so much time and money on over the previous 12 years ensured that the Canadiens didn't falter. Dickie Moore continued to shine, winning the top scorer award again with 96 individual points. In fact, the Canadiens dominated in all award categories, winning goaltender, defenseman, rookie, and league titles to go along with the Cup. The Cup that season was won 4-1 over the Maple Leafs, and the Canadiens had become the first team to win 4 in a row. The next season, 59-60, started off strong, beating the all-star team made up of the best players from the other teams. They continued on through October and November with 17 wins, 4 ties, and 2 losses. Perhaps the success was something of a given at this point, or expected, because in both Jenish's book and the Wikipedia entry about this season, the goaltender Plante is given special mention, not regarding his terrific on-ice ability, but rather his adoption of the face mask. Like the Canadian goalies before him, the constant cuts, collisions, and bruises had begun to take their toll on Plante. I suppose 4 broken noses, fractured cheek and jawbones, and over 200 stitches would do that to anyone. After a particularly severe gash that required 7 stitches, Plante returned to the ice, donning the mask he used in practice. Although he wasn't the first goaltender to wear a mask during games, he effectively inspired widespread adoption. He won his 5th straight Vezina Award that year, and the Canadiens drove on to an improbable 10th consecutive Stanley Cup final. In the playoffs, they became the first team since the 52 Red Wings to win the Cup without a loss, sweeping both Chicago and Toronto 4-0. After the finals loss, the Leafs manager would say, "We lost to the greatest team of all time." So that ends the story, and we're going to turn to just what made this team so incredible. Once again, to begin, the overarching goal we're going to try and answer is, what strategies gave this team an outsized competitive advantage against its peers? Or, put more simply, what made it better than the rest? There are 7 categories that we'll touch on: coach, specialist, the squad/team, the player, innovation, tactics, and other. To begin, we're going to start with the coach. Toe Blake was a very important piece in the 5-peat. During the research, one specific thing kept jumping out to me that I touched on briefly: his disgust for losing and obsession with winning. One common trait of serial winners that I found is their hate of losing, which, when a loss does eventually come, often morphs into poor sportsmanship. It's as if these individuals are so focused on winning that when the opposite happens, it is almost literally unbelievable. Oftentimes, excuses are thrown about and poor behavior can be observed. Now, I don't necessarily believe that is a healthy behavior, but I do believe it gives a clue into success. If you remember, Blake snapped at that journalist after his first loss as a coach. After losing the Stanley Cups in the early 50s, he would snap at opposing fans and rush to the locker room. And perhaps this story best illustrates his reaction to losing. In the 61-62 season, so after the time period we're talking about today, the Canadiens lost in the semi-finals of the Cup, and Jenish describes Blake's reaction. Blake was so distraught after being eliminated that he initially barred everyone, including team officials, from the dressing room, but later omitted a reporter from the Canadian press. The players showered and dressed in silence. Blake, always a poor loser, had never seemed so low. The hate of losing and love for winning had a tremendous effect on his men. The players felt an expectation to live up to his standards, and they did live up to them for those 5 glorious years. The next category is the specialist. I think Frank Selke fits the bill quite nicely when we talk about the specialist for this team. We touched on his contributions regarding the farm system and the benefits that brought about for the team, but it is worth diving a tiny little bit more in here. Selke himself explained about the team of this time. It's the greatest team because it has more great players than any one team ever possessed. Some players that we use only occasionally would be stars with other clubs. That there is the perfect encapsulation of the farm system. For me, Selke's emphasis on talent development was one of the most important aspects to the Canadiens' consistency through this period. Next category is the squad/team. Selke also has a quote about the togetherness of the team. He says, "The team spirit and the strength that comes from 2 or more racial units on the club, each with a different approach mentally to the game." When he's talking about racial units, he means the French Canadians, English Canadians, those sorts of players. I didn't find any other direct quotes really talking about this aspect of the team, but the familiarity many of the players had with each other by coming up through the farm system was an advantage. Selke really quite strategically would have control of those players, and he would place the strongest prospects usually against each other, some cases together. So therefore, when they eventually did reach the Canadiens, those players had been playing with and against each other, and in some cases for 4, 5, 6 years. Next category is the player. And as mentioned previously, the Canadiens had an abundance of talent all over the ice in every position in depth that was the envy of all NHL franchises, thanks to Selke and his farm system. They did, however, have one that stood a head above that drove the team on, the Rocket. Jean Beliveau said Richard embodied a force and energy, something that rubbed off on many of his teammates and carried us to 5 straight championships. Coach Irvin said, "The Rocket was more than a hockey player. It was his fury, his desire, and his intensity that motivated the Canadiens." Glowing endorsements aside, his importance to the side can be seen simply in the Canadiens' record over the next couple seasons after his retirement in 1960. In the 60-61 season, the Habs unexpectedly lost to the Blackhawks in the semifinals 4-2 despite finishing 17 points above them during the regular season. Jenish writes, "The Hawks had gained the upper hand by out-hustling the Canadiens, by checking them closely and hitting ferociously." I'm not sure how well this aspect of Richard's character has been expressed today. I mean, I have talked a lot about him fighting and punching and those sorts of things, but he would never have been out-hustled by anyone. Furthermore, I'm sure that when Selke complained after the loss that the Hawks deliberately racked up 5 of our best players and not one of the Canadiens put a hand on them in retaliation. Richard, when hearing that, must have felt like that never would have happened if he had been in the team. The team missed the extra grit he brought. They had enough stars to night in, night out throughout the season dominate the league. But when it came down to the tight must-win games, the Canadiens missed the edge that the Rocket brought. The next season, the Canadiens again finished first in the league, this time 23 points ahead of Chicago, but inexplicably lost in the semifinals again to the Hawks. Richard was an irreplaceable figure. The piece of innovation that keeps jumping out to me, and probably to you, is the farm system. We've really touched on the benefits a lot, but it's worth repeating one more time. This innovation was not necessarily unique. We talked about the Maple Leafs having it and Canadiens sort of putting it into place, but no one could do it on the scale that the Canadiens and Selke did it. Selke just took the concept to its logical extreme, and the talent that he therefore had at his disposal was ridiculous. Next is the tactics category. To be honest, I did not really find anything crazy that the Canadiens did differently or any sort of innovation in their tactics. I really just think the combination of the hate losing coach plus talent better than anyone else had pulled them through games. The most glaring factor that fits into the other category is the French-Canadian connection to the Montreal Canadiens. No other team in the NHL during that time had a deep connection to a population of people so culturally distinct. The team was positioned in opposition to the Anglophone establishment, which led to the most passionate fan base, and the French-Canadian players on the team having that extra level of motivation. We've already discussed the Richard riots and how French Montrealers felt deep injustice, but this extended further when Richard's teammate Geoffrion, an English Canadian despite the pronunciation of his name, passed him in the scoring race while Richard was banned that season. He was booed by the Montreal crowd. All this to say, the players were able to tap into something extra when things got tough during the late 50s, which potentially influence results. Maybe I'm stretching a little bit here, but I do think that the underdog versus establishment storyline does lend something extra. So that's the main part of the analysis. Next is the comparison section that was new last episode. So I'm trying to tie together a theme that I've seen throughout all 3 episodes or 3 teams I've covered or 1 or 2 of the teams. And the key comparison I found was the fan base behind the team. The fan base supporting all 3 teams are very passionate, very opinionated, and often have some part of their deep identity tied up in the success of the team. All 3 sets of players felt like they were an extension of their supporters. Additionally, and perhaps more interestingly, all 3 teams could be seen as that underdog versus establishment victor. The Brazilian team in overcoming racism and given they were not a part of the established European nations. The All Blacks because they were a tiny little nation that was the little backwater cousin of England, and the Canadiens in their opposition to the English Canadian establishment. Those are some interesting comparisons that I drew out. Next is the application section. Now, how can I apply the lessons learned today to my own team? That's the question we're trying to answer. The key theme to take away that I think is, how do I, as a leader, unite my employees or players in search of some common goal? Like the Canadiens were united in representing a people that were downtrodden and viewed as inferior, team leaders also must seek to find a compelling reason for their reports to put that extra 10% of effort in that eventually brings about outsized returns. Having a clear, singular focus is essential. I think of some SpaceX employees recently that I saw quoted who say that they're singularly focused on building rockets capable of going to Mars. We're going to Mars. That's what we're focused on. That's our North Star. That's our guiding light. So how as a leader can I set a vision in place that is extremely motivating and causes my employees, my players, my whatever, to do that extra 10%? So concludes the analysis section. My favorite stat from 1955 to 1960 The Canadiens had a playoff record of 40-9 and never fell behind once in a series. That's crazy. 5 seasons, never falling behind once in a series. My favorite quote that I found: in 1959, Maclean's magazine ran a story on Richard. He said, "Howe is better than me. Schmidt was better. Almelac, lots of guys are better than me. Beliveau, Geoffrion, lots of guys on the Canadiens today are better hockey players than me." The reporter says, "What is it then that you have got if it isn't ability?" Richard, desire. Thanks for listening to this episode of Incredible Teams. I would love to hear your thoughts and feedback and recommendations. Please comment or message me what you think. I am still trying to improve rapidly. Subscribe and rate if you like what you heard, and help me pick out who to cover next. And see you on the next episode. Thanks.